Adam Miller had never been the kind of man who needed much from others. After nearly 2 decades working in corporate risk management, he had developed a quiet, calculated rhythm to his life. One where facts, evidence, and preparation always outweighed noise or impulse. It wasn't that he disliked people, but he preferred order, logic, and the kind of solitude that came with owning his time. So, when he bought the house in Willow Creek Estates, a new, environmentally focused residential development just outside the city, he wasn't looking for community potlucks or Sunday morning jogs with neighbors. What he wanted was space, silence, and a piece of stability after a chaotic divorce and the draining bureaucracy of his previous job. The house had everything he needed: a small but sleek yard, enough distance from the other units to avoid casual intrusion, and, most importantly, a back patio with room for the grill he had been dreaming about for months. His sister Laura, who had stood by him throughout the worst parts of his divorce, was the first guest he invited over. She brought a bottle of red wine and the kind of cynical humor only older siblings can deliver without offense. They laughed, grilled ribeyes, and reminisced about growing up in their father's wood-paneled kitchen. It was a modest evening, deliberately so. Just 2 adults recovering from life's messes over a properly cooked steak and the kind of silence that doesn't require filling. The backyard grill, which Adam had assembled by hand, felt like a small personal monument. This, he thought, was what peace looked like. The first sign of something strange came not during the meal, but the following morning. As Adam stepped outside to retrieve the mail, he found a folded piece of paper wedged between the front door and the storm frame. Not a printed flyer or typed notice, but a handwritten message on textured beige paper. At first, he assumed it was a welcome note, perhaps from a neighbor who'd seen the moving van and wanted to be friendly. But the content of the letter disarmed that assumption immediately. The handwriting, meticulous and curiously large, read, "The smell of scorched animal flesh violates my right to a breathable, ethical existence. You may feel entitled to your choices, but I have a right to live free of sensory assault. Please refrain from future combustion of meat in the open air. This is not an unreasonable request." No name, no signature, no return address. Just the unsettling confidence of someone who felt entirely justified in using language like ethical existence and sensory assault. Adam reread it twice, making sure he wasn't missing satire, but there was nothing ironic about it. The tone was cold and direct, as if morality itself had been weaponized into a kind of bureaucratic hostility. He set the note on the counter and shrugged it off, assuming, wrongly, that it was a one-off letter from someone too invested in their own righteousness. Later that week, as Adam returned home from a late afternoon run to the grocery store, he found a police cruiser idling near the curb in front of his house. The sight gave him pause. Not because he feared anything illegal, but because the presence of law enforcement in a neighborhood like Willow Creek typically meant someone had called them over something trivial. He parked his car and approached the house cautiously. One of the officers, a tall man with sun-darkened skin and tired eyes, stepped toward him. "Mr. Miller?" he asked in a flat tone. Adam nodded. "Got a call about a potential incident at this address," the officer continued, glancing down at a notepad. Caller reported ongoing, ritualistic cooking of dead animal parts. Claimed it was creating psychological trauma and a noxious ethical atmosphere. "You mind if we have a quick chat?" Adam blinked, caught somewhere between irritation and disbelief. "Are you serious?" he asked, voice neutral but firm. "It was a steak. I made steak last weekend." The officer sighed as if he had expected that answer. "Look, I get it. You're not in trouble. There's no law against grilling on your own property. We're just here because the person who called, has made several complaints in the past. About other residents, too." Adam invited them to take a look around, even offered to show the grill itself, which was clean and unused since that weekend. The officers didn't seem particularly interested. Their visit was procedural, a box to check before moving on. As they left, one of them turned and said in a lower voice, "Watch yourself with that one. She files complaints like clockwork, and she's not above stretching the truth." Later that night, Adam searched through the neighborhood's online directory. The name Karen Sloan popped up beside a unit 3 doors down. A brief profile noted her as Community Wellness Liaison, whatever that meant. A few social media searches confirmed the rest. Self-described eco-activist, vegan blogger, advocate for non-toxic communal environments. Her last dozen posts included phrases like "meat is murder by mouth" and "shared air, shared responsibility." Adam tried not to let it bother him. He'd dealt with far more insidious personalities in the corporate world. People who lied with spreadsheets, who weaponized silence in boardrooms. But something about this was different. In the office, at least, battles had rules. Here, in this supposedly peaceful suburban setting, there were no clear terms. Just the creeping suspicion that someone had already decided he was the villain in their personal narrative. He didn't respond to the note. He didn't confront her. He didn't post anything online. He simply cleaned the grill, folded the cover neatly over it, and returned to his routine. He told himself that one strange neighbor didn't define the neighborhood, but even as he went about his week, picking up groceries, reviewing contracts for a freelance consulting gig, chatting briefly with his sister, a quiet unease took root. He noticed shadows of movement through blinds, caught glimpses of someone standing motionless at the edge of the sidewalk watching his house. He started waking up earlier, unsure why. And each morning, without fail, he would check the front door, not for packages but for another note. None came. For a time. It wasn't until the following weekend that the next escalation arrived. Subtle, yet invasive. As Adam stepped onto his back patio to water the small potted garden near the fence, he noticed a faint but unnatural scent in the air. Chemical, acidic, and unmistakably artificial. At first, he thought something had spilled, but when he followed the source, he found it. A small object, no bigger than a deck of cards, discreetly placed near his grill. It was a scent disperser, the kind used in pest control. Someone had planted it on his property, set to release bursts of synthetic odor at intervals. A quiet message. "If you won't stop your behavior, we'll create discomfort until you do." Adam removed the device, bagged it with gloves, and placed it in the garage. That evening, he reviewed the camera footage from the back gate, recently installed for general security. The motion-triggered clips showed nothing conclusive. Only the flicker of movement in the dark, too far to identify. It wasn't enough to accuse anyone, but it was more than enough to confirm what he already feared. Someone wasn't just expressing displeasure, someone was acting with purpose. And yet, even then, he didn't retaliate. He made no threats, filed no complaint. Instead, he sent a quiet message of his own. He ordered a second grill. Larger, smokeless, infrared-controlled, technically compliant with local guidelines. He wasn't escalating. He was preparing. Because Adam Miller wasn't a fighter by nature. But he knew exactly how to win wars that other people didn't even realize they had started. The following week passed without incident. But the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like planning. Adam was used to patterns, trained to observe them. Quantify risk based on what didn't happen just as much as what did. He had learned long ago that quiet often preceded disruption, especially when ideology was involved. On the surface, Willow Creek Estates still looked idyllic. Carefully maintained gardens, symmetrical hedges, kids biking in controlled loops, the subtle hum of wealth managed with precision. But beneath it, something was shifting. Something cold, performative, and unmistakably targeted. It started with a letter, this time official. Folded into a thick white envelope, delivered not by mail but slipped under his door, it bore the emblem of the Neighborhood Coordination Board, a fancy term for the Internal Governance Committee. The language was bureaucratic and almost smug in its vagueness. Dear resident, we have received reports concerning the emission of airborne irritants from your property. As you are aware, our development prides itself on promoting an environmentally harmonious living experience. In order to uphold these standards, we kindly request that you temporarily cease all open-air food preparation involving animal products until further review. No signatures, no dates for that supposed review, and no reference to any regulation he might have violated. Just a passive-aggressive directive masquerading as a polite suggestion. Adam scanned the document again, noting the absence of anything actionable. There were no citations, no ordinance numbers, nothing enforceable. It was designed not to restrict legally, but to pressure socially. A carefully written threat that dared him to push back so they could escalate formally. He folded the letter, placed it in a file marked Neighborhood Correspondence, and went about his day. He wasn't ready to fight yet, but he was no longer inclined to pretend there wasn't a fight coming. By midweek, subtle changes began to surface. His access code to the resident gym stopped working. When he inquired, the receptionist offered a clipped response. There's a system review in progress. Some accounts have been temporarily deactivated. The parking fob for his visitor, Laura, who had planned to drop by after a work trip, was flagged as non-compliant with no explanation. Packages started arriving with delays, and on 2 occasions Adam found them placed on the sidewalk rather than the doorstep. It was death by 1,000 cuts, a slow drip of inconvenience orchestrated to seem accidental. Then came the second police visit. This time it was late afternoon, the sun still high, shadows stretching cleanly across his driveway. The officers arrived in the same car, same duo as before, but their demeanor had shifted slightly. Less apologetic, more procedural. The taller one, who had previously confided that the neighbor was persistent, now read from a tablet with an air of forced neutrality. "Mr. Miller," he began, "we received a secondary complaint from the same resident as before, citing potential environmental hazards originating from your property, specifically airborne particulates and olfactory disturbances due to food combustion." Adam stared at him. "So, someone didn't like the smell of my dinner?" The officer didn't flinch. "We're obligated to follow up when the complaint includes health language. The report used terminology indicating respiratory distress and psychosomatic impact." Adam's tone sharpened. "And what exactly am I being accused of this time? Psychological assault via ribeye?" The officer remained steady. "Again, you're not accused of a crime, but the documentation will reflect a pattern of reported incidents." That phrasing stuck with him. Reported incidents. Not proven, not validated, but recorded. The file would grow, line by line, each baseless accusation adding weight, building a case not in court, but in perception. He thanked the officers with clipped politeness and watched them drive away. As soon as they were gone, he made 3 phone calls, first to his legal consultant, second to a private security firm, and third to a close colleague who had handled a similar case years ago involving property-level defamation and coordinated harassment under the guise of civic action. None of these were dramatic moves. They were calculated responses from a man who understood how reputations erode, not from scandal, but from the slow accumulation of static. 2 days later, the situation escalated again. Returning from a brief morning run, Adam found his front yard staked with laminated signs, color-printed and mounted on short plastic rods. They read, "Meat smoke, community harm, clean air is a shared right," and "Think before you burn flesh." At the bottom of each sign was the same logo from the neighborhood board letterhead, modified with the addition of a green leaf and a raised fist. It wasn't graffiti. It was a campaign. Someone had printed these, designed them, distributed them, not just on his lawn, but around the cul-de-sac. As he drove later that day, he saw one in front of the mailbox station and another near the tennis courts. Adam removed the signs on his own property and bagged them as evidence. He sent a firm, professional notice to the board requesting an immediate explanation, citing property rights and unauthorized use of communal logos. He also contacted the City Code Enforcement Division, not to retaliate, but to create his own paper trail. This wasn't just a dispute anymore. It was a systematic attempt to isolate and provoke. And he knew better than to react emotionally. He didn't go online. He didn't post photos or rants. He documented, archived, and quietly prepared a formal complaint with timestamps, photos, and legal references. That weekend, he attended a neighborhood forum, not out of enthusiasm, but necessity. He didn't speak unless spoken to. When asked directly about the complaints, he responded clearly. "I cook on my property with legal equipment, within legal time frames, using legal ingredients. If there's an actual ordinance I'm violating, I'm happy to review it. But I will not stop feeding myself because someone else has a philosophical objection." A few heads nodded. A few didn't. Karen Sloan sat at the far end of the room, poised and controlled, her expression blank. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was strategic. Adam watched her, measured the tension in the room, and understood something crucial. This wasn't just about her. She had tapped into something broader. Fear of confrontation. Fear of appearing insensitive. Fear of being labeled hostile by someone who weaponized the language of sensitivity itself. It was no longer about meat. It was about control, about testing how far a narrative could go if no one dared to challenge it. By the time the meeting ended, Adam had already decided on his next step. Not escalation, not counter-aggression, but precision. He would tighten his boundaries, increase surveillance, document every breach, and, most importantly, force transparency. Because if his opposition insisted on manufacturing a moral crisis, then he would meet them with something far more inconvenient. Verifiable truth. 3 days after the neighborhood meeting, Adam noticed the change not in some grand announcement or direct confrontation, but in the way his email inbox filled overnight with a series of coordinated compliance notifications. The subject lines were all identical. Notice of environmental sensitivity zone violation, issued through the same neighborhood board portal that typically sent out newsletters about plant swaps and power washing reminders. The content was far from routine. According to the messages, Adam's property had been provisionally designated as an environmental sensitivity zone conflict site, citing multiple anonymous complaints and documented olfactory disturbances affecting adjacent lots. The wording was deliberately vague, designed to sound regulatory but built on nothing but social engineering. He read through the entire chain twice, searching for any citation of a legal code or verifiable ordinance, but found only circular references to ethical airspace guidelines and communal well-being principles, outlined in non-binding community values documents that had never been part of the formal agreement he signed at closing. At the end of the third email, there was a warning. If no corrective action was acknowledged within 7 days, the matter would be escalated to the board's Alternative Behavior Resolution Committee. Adam chuckled at the absurdity of the title, something between a therapy session and a tribunal, but the humor didn't last. The next day, while on a Zoom call with a client, he heard a loud thump outside his home office window. He excused himself and stepped out to find that someone had dumped a bag of rotting produce at the edge of his property line. Beets, celery, decaying carrots, and a soaked paper tag labeled "Offer of Rebalancing." It was performative hostility, dressed up in symbolic language, and it reeked, literally and figuratively, of desperation, cloaked as righteousness. He checked the footage from his security system, but whoever had done it approached from the greenbelt path where visibility was blocked by a row of manicured hedges. The gesture wasn't meant to frighten him. It was meant to humiliate, to suggest that he had been judged and found lacking, and now was being offered some passive-aggressive act of supposed redemption. Adam documented everything: the emails, the produce, the footage, the timestamp. He sent it all to his attorney, who responded with a tight, succinct reply. "They're baiting you. Don't take it, but let's start the formal process now." That process began with an official cease and desist letter to the neighborhood board, demanding that all further communications regarding unsubstantiated behavioral designations be suspended until proper review and formal legal clarity were applied. It also included a request for the names of any individuals making repeated accusations under the guise of anonymity, an action protected under local anti-harassment laws when the complaints create a pattern of provable harm. Within 48 hours, Adam received a response, not from the board, but from a law firm representing them, or more precisely, representing their internal liability shield. The letter denied any wrongdoing, claimed all actions were community-driven, and stated that the board simply facilitated the will of concerned residents. There was no mention of Karen Sloan, but Adam didn't need confirmation. Her fingerprints were on every word, every action, every carefully phrased document designed to alienate him without ever saying so directly. She understood plausible deniability better than most executives he'd gone up against. Things escalated physically the next day. As Adam pulled into his driveway returning from a routine trip to the hardware store, he found two unfamiliar men standing at the edge of his property, one holding a clipboard, the other carrying a small air quality monitor. They weren't from the city. Their car bore no municipal plates, only a nondescript white decal that read Community Harmonics Consulting. When Adam stepped out and asked them who they were, the man with the clipboard introduced himself as a third-party compliance assessor contracted by neighborhood leadership. His tone was friendly but firm. He explained that they were conducting non-invasive measurements of particulate concentration and aroma retention in designated zones. Adam stared for a long second before responding. "You mean you're here to smell my backyard?" The man didn't flinch. "We're collecting data to understand how certain emissions affect residents with heightened sensitivities." "On whose authority?" "The community's request." "That's not an answer," Adam said, stepping between them and the yard gate. "This is private property. You're not authorized to conduct anything here. If I see you again on this street without city credentials or a warrant, I'll have the sheriff sort it out." The two men didn't argue. They simply nodded, marked something on their clipboard, and walked back to their car. That night, Adam drafted and sent another formal notice, this time to the board, the law firm, and copied the city's community engagement office. It was calm, measured, and filled with legal citations. But the subtext was clear. The games were over. From now on, every incident would be met with escalation. Not emotional, but legal and public. The retaliation came not in the form of more inspectors, but through erosion of normalcy. His trash wasn't picked up on collection day. His name vanished from the residence portal for amenity booking. Two of his recurring grocery delivery services flagged his address as restricted due to complaint activity, despite no record of such claims with the companies. He spent hours on the phone, untangling the web of phantom flags, each one accidentally applied through some algorithm that had been fed bad data. Then came the whisper campaign. Neighbors stopped waving. One man he had exchanged brief morning greetings with for weeks now crossed the street when walking his dog. A woman who had previously complimented his landscaping muttered something about toxins in the soil as she passed his house. It became clear that Karen wasn't trying to win a case against him. She was trying to build consensus, not based on facts, but on suspicion. It was social manipulation at its purest form. Turn someone into other, and let the group's discomfort do the rest. But Adam didn't crumble. He adapted. He invited his attorney to meet on site. He paid for a certified environmental assessment by an independent lab. Results clean, no violations, 0 impact levels. He documented the full report and submitted it to both the city and the neighborhood board, copied to every official contact he had. He wasn't just defending himself now. He was building a shield of undeniable truth. Karen, meanwhile, escalated again. Not directly. She never acted directly. But flyers began appearing at the clubhouse bulletin board. Join us for clean living conversations, addressing meat smoke, mold, and mindfulness. The language was polite, coded, weaponized. Adam knew what it was, a public forum staged to pathologize his existence. He didn't attend. He didn't need to. A sympathetic neighbor sent him a recording. The session was everything he expected. Half wellness talk, half ideological purge, with Karen presenting case studies about persistent environmental violators and how they affected communal harmony. She never used his name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew who she meant. That week, Adam received notice that his backyard patio, previously approved through standard procedural forms, was now under review for non-compliant use of outdoor fixtures. It was absurd, but it wasn't surprising. They weren't trying to remove him. They were trying to grind him down until he either left or broke character. But Adam wasn't made of that material. He adjusted, replaced his grill with a smokeless model, installed redundant security cameras, started quietly logging the behavioral changes of his neighbors, not to retaliate, but to identify who was watching, who was acting, and who might be used against him. The data wasn't for revenge. It was for survival. Because when you're painted as the problem, evidence is your only oxygen. By the end of that month, Adam had become something new. Not a victim, not a crusader, but a man under siege, sharpening every move, documenting every moment, and preparing, not for a fight, but for a reckoning. One not built on fury or flames, but on patience and precision. Because the line had been crossed, not with fire, but with silence. And now he intended to respond the only way that worked, with undeniable clarity. It was late September when Adam realized that the fight had crossed an invisible line. From nuisance to psychological pressure, from a petty neighborhood spat into something systemic and ritualized, structured around the quiet power of bureaucracy and the calculated cruelty of plausible ideology. He hadn't lost anything physical. His home remained intact, his grill untouched, and the interior of his life, at least on paper, was still his own. But the air around him had changed. He felt it when he walked out to his driveway and sensed eyes behind blinds, when the mail carrier dropped letters 2 houses away but avoided eye contact with him, when even the seasonal newsletter failed to mention his address in the homeowners spotlight section, despite his recent yard renovation that had met every design criterion listed in the residential code. What was happening wasn't loud, wasn't obvious. It was slow attrition, corrosion disguised as administration, each little dent in his daily life a part of a broader campaign designed not to destroy him but to erase him politely. The message was clear. He was still allowed to exist here, but only if he existed silently, apologetically, and without disturbing the balance of their curated ecosystem. His lawyer, a woman named Meredith Tolan, with the calm aggression of someone who had spent 15 years fighting corporate municipal abuse, had advised him to remain outwardly cooperative while doubling down on documentation. She was impressed by the volume of evidence he'd already compiled: letters, recordings, legal notices, photographic records of sign placements, and unauthorized inspections. But she also warned him that the opposition wouldn't play fair. People like this, she said during one call, don't actually care about winning in court. They care about creating an illusion of consensus. They win when you start explaining yourself. They win when others watch you become defensive. So don't fight for approval. Fight for record. Build proof. Use their language against them. Taking her advice to heart, Adam requested a full audit from the city planning office, not of his property, but of the neighborhood's zoning practices and governance structure. It was a move few residents ever considered because most assumed these documents were inaccessible or irrelevant. But Adam knew where to look and what to request, and within 10 business days, he had access to a full archive of internal policy memos, structural guidelines, and environmental impact statements filed over the last 7 years. He wasn't looking for corruption. He was looking for contradiction. It didn't take long to find one. In a quarterly operations memo from 2 years prior, the community board had outlined an internal initiative called Phase Living Compliance, which included recommendations for voluntary emission discipline and public encouragement of green, normativity through symbolic signage and verbal prompts. It wasn't law. It wasn't enforceable. It was policy theater. But in the hands of someone like Karen Sloan, it became a weapon, soft power disguised as cultural evolution. That finding was a turning point, not because it gave him grounds to sue, but because it exposed the machinery behind the performance. This wasn't Karen acting alone out of personal disdain. It was Karen weaponizing a cultural suggestion, turning communal suggestion into communal discipline, all under the guise of values. The neighborhood's obsession with eco-consciousness wasn't fake, but the way it was being used was opportunistic. Karen hadn't invented the rules. She had just realized that nobody would question them if she enforced them with the right tone, in the right language, dressed in enough environmental concern. Armed with this knowledge, Adam changed his tactics. He submitted the audit findings to Meredith and included a formal letter demanding clarification from the board about whether any of their notices, complaints, or interventions were based on binding policy or merely aspirational goals presented as obligations. The board's response was tepid and riddled with conditional language. They admitted that many of their communications were reflective of the neighborhood's culture of mutual respect and not intended to be construed as enforceable regulation. It was, essentially, an admission that everything sent to Adam so far was hollow, but that hollow threat had caused him measurable damage. The lawyer drafted a response invoking psychological harassment statutes and laid the foundation for a broader complaint, not to the board, but to the County Housing Council and the Office of Community Oversight. That same week, a curious thing happened. The neighborhood began receiving flyers about a proposed Ethical Environment Amendment, which, if adopted, would establish voluntary commitments to restrict meat preparation in shared, outdoor areas. It was phrased softly, wrapped in words like choice, respect, and collective wellness. But Adam could see the through line. This was Karen's move to retroactively justify her campaign. If she couldn't prove he violated the rules, she would try to write the rules around what he did. And while the proposal was non-binding, it came with a public sign-up sheet, placed in the common space near the mailboxes with space for residents to endorse the amendment. The list wasn't just about policy. It was about identifying sides, drawing a line between those who supported the clean air cause and those who didn't. Adam didn't touch it, didn't engage publicly, but he took pictures. By the end of the first day, 9 signatures appeared. None of them surprised him. But what did surprise him was the conversation that followed. The next morning, as he stepped out to retrieve his paper, a man from 3 houses down, Rick Stanton, a retired airline mechanic known more for his backyard woodworking than his opinions, walked up and asked if Adam had seen the new petition. Adam said yes neutrally. Rick hesitated, then said, "My wife signed it. Karen came by the night before and made it sound like this was a health thing. Like if we didn't agree, we'd be the ones not respecting safety. I didn't like how she said it." Adam didn't say much. He just nodded. But that moment marked another shift, because now, even if quietly, someone had admitted discomfort. Someone had acknowledged the pressure. It was small, but it was real. The illusion of consensus had cracked. Adam relayed this to Meredith, who told him, "That's what we need. Not outrage, not protest. Just one honest admission that the campaign is coercive." They began preparing a filing for intentional psychological manipulation under neighborhood governance statutes. Not a lawsuit, but an injunction against further anonymous harassment pending. Formal review of Karen's amendment proposal. The document included a statement of concern about systemic alienation based on lawful lifestyle choices and the documented pattern of indirect hostility, all backed by collected evidence and city records. When the board received the filing, their silence said everything. No reply for days, no new notices, no additional flyers. Karen didn't post new updates online. For the first time in weeks, Adam's name and presence were not the topic of indirect policy motions. It was not a victory, not yet, but it was something close to pressure finally applied in the right direction. He didn't feel safe. He didn't feel vindicated. But he felt steady. And sometimes, in the middle of a siege, steadiness is the best armor you can wear. By the time the second escalation fully took form, it was no longer about a single man's barbecued dinner or a neighbor's exaggerated moral objection. It had become an organized campaign of exclusion and psychological pressure, executed with the clinical detachment of policy enforcement rather than personal vendetta. Adam understood that the first phase, verbal warnings, passive-aggressive signage, covert scent devices, had been testing boundaries, seeking to provoke a reaction that would seem irrational or disproportionate. When he kept responding with logic and evidence, the campaign shifted gears, moving away from overt nuisance into institutional control. He first noticed the change in how essential services interacted with him. One morning, his driveway was piled with unopened mail, seemingly abandoned by the postal carrier. The following day, he discovered the lockbox key for the mowing and gardening crew missing, though their equipment still showed signs of recent use around his lawn and hedges. Curious, he spoke to the landscaping company, who confirmed that they had been told by a client on record, the managing committee, backed by anonymous reports, to avoid servicing his property due to special air quality protocols. When Adam asked for documentation, the company simply apologized and walked away. This silent service cutoff was designed to instill frustration, erode his comfort, and isolate his home without drawing direct blame. His insurance agent called next, requesting an impromptu audit. Adam, expecting a routine question, found himself fielding inquiries about community risk factors tied to his address. When he insisted on a reason, the agent admitted that he had received feedback from neighbors outlining a history of complaints about his lifestyle. The agent was firm. Without documented proof that the area had previously permitted barbecue as he had practiced it, the policy could be placed into a limited review, potentially affecting renewal and rates. Adam was 100% within his rights, but that didn't stop the ripple effect. One insurance anomaly led to another. His home monitoring system flagged a non-existent fire alarm activation, which led to a brief intrusive verification call from the alarm company, followed by a surcharge warning. Meanwhile, the subtle, But increasingly aggressive, social engineering continued apace. Flyers for community integrity checks began to appear in his building's lobby. Anonymous surveys asking residents if they felt cultural cohesion was being undermined by inconsistent environmental choices. There was no mention of him by name, but the message was unmistakable. His presence had become a social liability, and the neighborhood was being asked to weigh in. These flyers carried the same semi-official branding he had seen before, a leaf and fist logo, making them seem sanctioned while maintaining plausible deniability. They suggested that approving the survey equated to supporting shared standards, while refusing might brand someone as unsupportive of communal harmony. Adam refused the survey and lodged a formal objection through the city's Community Standards Board. The survey was pulled 2 days later with a short statement of thanks for voluntary feedback. But the damage had been done. It sowed doubt among longtime residents, causing a few to hesitate in greeting him. One neighbor who used to wave every morning stopped, instead giving him a curt nod from across the drive. Another, an older couple who played bocce on the weekend, now played alone at a slight remove, visiting his house only when he texted to invite them. With each interaction, or lack thereof, Adam was being isolated, not by law, but by the fear of association. It was during this time that a formal complaint was filed by an anonymous group of residents demanding a hearing before the community council. The stated concerns: repeated existential disturbance, potential private-to-public health impact, and non-compliance with unspoken environmental expectations. A hearing date was set for just under 3 weeks out. Despite Meredith's advice to avoid public confrontation, Adam understood this was crucial, a turning point where he could confront the myth head-on. He prepared meticulously for the hearing, compiling evidence, organizing neighbor testimonies, corroborating his case with environmental data, legal findings from the city audit, and expert statements. He composed his remarks not as a defensive victim, but as a citizen asserting his rights, built on clarity rather than emotion. Then, at the darkest moment of this second escalation, it went mercilessly personal. Late one evening, he received a number of disturbing messages through his home's AI-enabled assistant device, the kind with simple voice-activated commands and basic scheduling functionality. The devices spoke in a voice identical to the assistant's brand voice but delivered harsh statements, seeded with personal references. "You are violating our air. Your choices cost us our clean revival. Remove your grill or regret your passive aggression. We watch, we care, we judge." The messages were asynchronous, anonymous, and impossible to trace, except that they arrived through his own network. He shut down the devices, removed their batteries, and disconnected them from Wi-Fi. Though no proof tied them to a person, the fear they were listening, not through cameras, was enough to remind him this was no longer a dispute but a surveillance campaign. It wasn't paranoia. It was fact. Someone was staging deep intrusions under the guise of moral sensitivity and using technology to break his trust in his own home. Despite the escalating personal nature, Adam refused to cave. He reframed the upcoming hearing as his opportunity to deconstruct an ideology masquerading as environmental responsibility. He enlisted 2 witnesses, Rick Stanton, the neighbor who admitted his wife had signed a petition under pressure, and a woman named Ellen, who delivered groceries to Adam and reported he was always polite and neighborly. Both agreed to testify anonymously. "I don't want to be attacked," Rick said, but their presence alone would undermine the narrative of communal consensus. Meredith also hired the assistant general counsel from the city's Department of Civil Liberties to attend as an observer. Though this official would not speak, her presence lent the hearing a civil weight and signaled that the matter was now under government scrutiny. On the morning of the hearing, Adam arrived early, carrying a single binder of documents, a copy of his presentation, and his measured determination. The room, the community center's refurbished library, was modest but formal. A small dais held the council members, fluorescent lights gently reflecting off the polished wood. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, and a microphone stood at center front. There were about 30 people, half of them curious neighbors, others residents who looked uneasy, and a handful clearly supportive of Karen's initiative, identifiable by their matching green ribbons. Karen herself was present, poised and composed, offering nothing but thin smiles and icy applause when a supporter spoke. When it was Adam's turn to speak, he stepped forward and began. He didn't start with passion or anger. He started with context. His profession, his move here after divorce, his desire for a peaceful evening with family. He spoke of the procedural fog that had descended around him. Not one letter citing a code, one notice quoting a law, one ordinance specifying what he had done wrong. He walked them through the recorded visits, the letters, the third-party surveys, the disrupted services, the AI messages, the psychological scope of isolation tactics. When it was time to present his witnesses, he played short clips of Rick saying, "I was told it was a health concern," and Ellen saying, "I've never smelled anything unusual from his yard." Both voices quivered, but also rang, quietly with truth. He ended his remarks by handing each council member a folded printout. A city audit memo showing that ethical guidelines were non-binding, an email chain cataloging each service disruption, and the legal complaint he had filed. He closed with one sentence that brought silence to the room. "This is not about air, and it is not about meat. It is about control, cloaked in neighborliness. And I refuse to live as a prescriptive ideology practiced on someone else's doorstep." The council retreated to deliberate. Seated to his side, Meredith gave him a firm nod. Karen fidgeted with her ribbon. After what felt like hours, they returned. The lead official, a former judge now heading the council, spoke in crisp, even tones. They were dismissing the complaint due to lack of specific harm supported by municipal code, and they recommended integration of a clause in communications requiring concrete citation of regulations for any future complaint. Furthermore, they encouraged community-building events. Meat-inclusive potlucks were acceptable, so long as they complied with standard noise and fire regulations and never resulted in property damage. It wasn't a sweeping defeat of Karen. It didn't rid the neighborhood of her ideology. But it was an institutional check, a recognition that her campaign, however earnest, had overstepped its mandate. It was, in the context of this second escalation, a decisive counterstrike. Evidence, civics, and public testimony given precedence over vague moral theater. As he walked out of the meeting, several residents offered quiet apologies. Several others avoided eye contact, and one elderly woman even placed a sympathetic hand on his shoulder. Karen was silent, dignified, her expression tight, and there was no applause. Instead, there was something heavier, the acknowledgement that her influence had limits, enforced not by anger or division, but by reasoned boundaries and community oversight. The second escalation had peaked and collapsed, not with violence, but with transparency. And as Adam drove home, Binder on the passenger seat, he realized the ground had shifted. This was no longer just his fight. It was the fight for a community's right to define itself not through exclusion, but through lawful speech and private choice. In the weeks following the council hearing, the tension in the neighborhood didn't disappear. It recalibrated. No longer fueled by passive-aggressive flyers or abstract campaigns, the energy shifted into something quieter but more complex, like a room where a confrontation had occurred but the furniture remained perfectly arranged. Adam's victory at the hearing had not ended the conflict, but it had exposed its machinery, forcing those who had supported Karen's initiative to confront, if only privately, the questionable means by which it had been waged. Some neighbors resumed casual greetings. A few returned to their routines as if nothing had happened, eager to reclaim a sense of normalcy. But Adam knew better. When power is challenged, it doesn't dissolve. It retreats, regroups, and waits for another format. And sure enough, the pushback returned, not through hostility this time, but through institutional delay and bureaucratic silence. Requests Adam filed for minor exterior repairs, such as repainting his fence or replacing a cracked patio tile, went unanswered for weeks, despite clear compliance with guidelines. Appointments to use shared amenities like the clubhouse were marked pending and left unresolved. At the community suggestion box near the entrance gate, someone posted a handwritten note under the glass. "Justice doesn't mean we have to live in your smoke." There was no signature, no official branding, just another drop in the endless tide of implied grievance. Adam kept his responses steady. He didn't retaliate or escalate. He continued logging every interaction, every delay, every trace of the slow institutional squeeze that tried to punish him not with confrontation, but with inertia. Then came the letter, not from Karen, not from the board, but from a newly formed neighborhood volunteer council created independently to foster restorative dialogue and environmental growth. It wasn't an official arm of governance, but it had the trappings of one: custom letterhead, vague affiliations, and a condescending tone hidden behind community wellness jargon. The letter thanked Adam for his participation in civic procedures and invited him to attend a restorative integration session, where he could collaboratively reflect on how divergent lifestyle choices impact collective psychological health. It was a linguistic trap, a post-victory reframing that assumed wrongdoing even as it claimed to offer reconciliation. Adam read the letter once, folded it, and placed it in his evidence file without response. Meredith was less calm. "This is the next tactic," she told him. "They lost legally. Now they're trying to make you submit socially. They want to extract confession through consensus pressure. Don't play into it, but be prepared. They're not done yet." She was right. Within days of the letter, Adam's home was again flagged in the residents' internal newsletter, this time under a new section called Spotlight Reflections, where anonymous contributors could voice concerns about communal energy imbalances. The entries were vague, almost poetic, but clearly targeting him. "The smoke may have cleared, but the air remains thick with residue," one line read. Another added, "Sometimes legal doesn't mean right, it just means loud." The editorial board claimed the entries were crowdsourced and anonymous, but their placement was intentional. The goal was not to argue, but to exhaust, to make Adam feel like no matter how many rules he followed, he would always be seen as the pollutant in their perfect ecosystem. Still, Adam endured. He doubled down on his professionalism, ensuring every public-facing act he made was quiet, correct, and courteous. He avoided confrontation, but never disappeared. He walked his property with his usual calm. He kept up his maintenance. He even added a small herb garden along the back fence, not as defiance, but as a visible reminder of his stability. It was during one of these walks, early one Saturday morning, that he noticed a trail of broken eggshells leading from the back gate to the base of his grill. Someone had left them deliberately. Not messy, not haphazard, but placed methodically in a line as if performing some abstract ritual. There was no note, no damage, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Contamination, protest, some perverse mix of shame and condemnation. Adam documented it, cleared the shells with gloves, and didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The act spoke for itself, but beneath his outward control, fatigue was setting in. This wasn't a fight for property anymore. It was a fight for narrative, and narratives once poisoned don't heal easily. Meredith proposed they go public, not in a tabloid way, but through an op-ed, a carefully crafted statement in a regional paper about civic overreach disguised as moral activism. Adam hesitated. "I don't want to become the symbol of this," he said. "I just want to live in my home without needing to justify how I cook dinner." Meredith understood, but her reply was blunt. "They've already made you a symbol. Now you decide whether you'll be a silent one or a defined one." The decision weighed on him for days. He wrote drafts and deleted them. He made lists of pros and cons. Eventually, he declined, not because he was afraid, but because he sensed the narrative had already turned. His silence wasn't surrender anymore. It was control. And in a space where everyone was shouting about ethics, silence was the last kind of resistance they couldn't reinterpret. Then, without warning, Karen returned. Not physically, but through a legal maneuver that revealed just how far she was willing to go. She filed a petition with the county council to initiate a conditional usage review of the neighborhood itself, suggesting that environmental standards were being compromised by inconsistent domestic practices, and requesting that the entire development be reclassified under a new zoning designation with stricter air quality oversight. It was outrageous, extreme, and unlikely to pass. But it was brilliant. If approved, it would change the rules retroactively, not targeting Adam, but invalidating his lifestyle by redefining the standards under which he lived. The petition created chaos. Real estate agents began contacting homeowners. Property values were projected to drop if the reclassification succeeded. Residents who had once been indifferent now found themselves exposed to financial risk. That was when everything changed. A meeting was called, this time by the homeowners themselves, not the board. Adam didn't organize it. He didn't speak at it. He simply attended, stood near the back, and listened. One by one, people who had remained silent during his ordeal now spoke up, not out of moral solidarity, but out of economic fear. They questioned Karen's motivations. They expressed confusion about how the initiative had gained momentum without broader input. One man said flatly, "I'm not losing equity over kale." Karen tried to defend her proposal, claiming it was about community health, but the tone had shifted. Her moral certainty, once unchallenged, now sounded shrill. And for the first time, someone challenged her directly. A woman in her 60s stood and asked, "Do you ever stop to think that maybe you're not protecting us? You're just trying to control us?" The question lingered in the air like smoke. The county eventually rejected the petition, formally citing lack of evidence, procedural overreach, and the risk of setting dangerous precedent. The decision wasn't just a legal win. It was a public rebuke, a rare moment where ideology had pushed too far and the system had pushed back. For Adam, the win wasn't euphoric. It was heavy, somber, and oddly anticlimactic. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He simply walked home, past people who now saw him not as a symbol or threat, but as a man who had endured something invisible and poisonous, and survived. And in a neighborhood obsessed with appearances, survival was the most disruptive thing he could have done. In the days following the failed petition, the rhythm of the neighborhood slowly returned to something resembling its former quiet. The signs disappeared first. No more flyers, no anonymous surveys, no public invitations to community healing sessions thinly veiled as trials. The air felt lighter, though not entirely clear. There was no apology, no reconciliation committee, no public acknowledgement of the damage inflicted. Not by Karen, not by the board, and certainly not by those who had enabled the isolation campaign in silence. But Adam hadn't expected that. He understood people rarely apologize when they've rationalized their behavior as virtue. What mattered wasn't their contrition. It was the fact that the machine they had built no longer worked, Neighbors returned to their routines with the quiet awkwardness of people trying to forget they had taken sides. Some offered hesitant nods or half smiles in the street. A few more offered subtle acknowledgments. A freshly baked pie left on his porch without a note, a sudden invitation to a neighborhood book club that had previously passed him over. None of it erased what had happened, but it offered something closer to a treaty than a truce, a silent acceptance that he had become part of the fabric they could no longer rip apart without unraveling themselves. Karen, for her part, didn't vanish. She still walked the sidewalks, still tended to her meticulously curated garden, still posted online about eco-conscious living. But the tone of her online voice shifted. There were no more veiled accusations or posts hinting at toxic invaders or spiritual contamination. Her words became generic again, sterile, stripped of crusade. The woman who had once wielded ideology like a sword now used it like a bumper sticker, blunt, harmless, and easy to ignore. Adam didn't gloat. He didn't reassert himself through provocation or statement. He returned to his private routines, morning walks, quiet weekends on the patio, family visits where laughter finally came without a trace of vigilance. The new grill remained, upgraded and compliant, but he used it not out of defiance, but because it was his, and that, in the end, had been the whole point. Ownership without apology. Peace without surrender. He spent less time checking his cameras, stopped cataloging every odd noise or misplaced item, and began, slowly, to reclaim the invisible ease that had been stolen from his home not by violence, but by suggestion. The legal file remained in his drawer, thick with notes and records, untouched now but not discarded. It was no longer armor. It was history, a reminder of what resistance looked like when fought not in public protest but in patience, clarity, and refusal to disappear. He kept in touch with Meredith, who had moved on to another case involving workplace retaliation disguised as moral enforcement. They spoke rarely, but always with mutual respect. Two people who had waded into a subtle war and emerged not with triumph, but with endurance. Months passed. Seasons changed. The house remained quiet, the street uneventful, the board meetings dry and procedural. Adam had no illusions about the world outside his neighborhood. He knew these battles were still being fought in other cul-de-sacs with other names, other tactics. But he also knew that his own fight had mattered, not just for himself, but for the invisible boundary he'd held on behalf of those who hadn't known how to name the pressure they felt. He had never asked to represent anyone, never set out to prove anything, but in the end, by refusing to fold, he had done both. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across his backyard, Adam stood over the grill turning steaks with quiet concentration. There was no audience, no spectators, just the soft hiss of heat, the scent of pepper and rosemary in the warm air. For the first time in a long while, he didn't look over his shoulder. He didn't listen for movement near the hedges or scan the gate for intruders. He simply cooked dinner, freely, normally, without a thought for who might be offended or watching. And in that moment, more than any victory at a council meeting or letter of dismissal, he knew the battle was over. Not because the opposition had been defeated, but because their presence no longer shaped his choices. They could whisper, they could watch, they could write their letters, but they could no longer make him flinch. And in a world increasingly eager to control the invisible spaces between people, that alone was a kind of freedom worth protecting.